The title of this episode is The Art of Change. Chances are you have a variety of thoughts and feelings about change, including when you have to lead it. And so I want you to realize that you've thought about this a lot, and everyone around you has thought and experienced a lot about this. And you may be thinking that you've studied it and you've led changes and you feel like you're missing something. You may be thinking that you'd like to find the Rosetta Stone to help you figure all this change stuff out. Or maybe you feel like it's just too complex to master. It's just part of the job. If you feel any of those things, you're going to love this conversation about how the art is at the heart of change efforts. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast in the future, you could join us live on your favorite social media channel. You can find out when those are happening, get information about those live episodes, and interact with us and get the information sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world that is more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective, a new set of tools to create the great results their organizations and team members want and need. That's what Flexible Leadership provides you. You can learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. Now, with that, I'm going to bring in my guest and I'm going to introduce him, and then we're going to dive in. My guest today is Dr. Jeff DeGraff. He is clinical professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business and the co-author of The Art of Change, Transforming Paradoxes into Breakthroughs. Known as the Dean of Innovation, he has spent 4 decades helping organizations from Fortune 500 companies to the U.S. military lead change from the edges, not the center. Jeff, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
Kevin, thanks for having me on.
We had the chance to chat before we went live. We have some things in common, which we probably won't get into today, but I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to wave to Melanie, and you can do the same. No one else will know what that's about, but we know, and we'll try to make sure she gets a chance to watch or listen to this. So, Jeff, when I got the book in the mail, I certainly knew who you were, and I loved the title, which got me to dive in, which almost immediately had me say, yeah, I want to have this guy on the show. But before we get to the book, I want to know a little bit about your journey that leads you to do the work that you do every day.
Well, it's interesting. I'm from Michigan. I'm from Western Michigan and grew up in a blue collar neighborhood. And through a series of almost Forrest Gump like opportunities, I ended up being a pretty young PhD. And at 25, I met a guy who had a small pizza company. And 5 years later, at 30, we sold Domino's Pizza to Mitt Romney and Bain Capital. And then I was 30 and didn't know what to do, and did a little stint with Apple and Steve Jobs and all that. And Michigan asked me if I wanted to come back and teach MBAs how to be creative. And I remember telling Bob Quinn, they're dull, drab, and awful. You can hear them think. And he said, yeah, I know. That's why we want you to do it. So I thought I would do it for a little bit of time. It's been almost 40 years. And over the years, I built these consulting practices, 2 of them, one not-for-profit and one for-profit. That's what brought me into the military because of the work I'd done at Apple and Google and GE and everybody else, right? So it became an issue of how do you build really sustainable, dynastic innovation ecosystems. That was my interest.
And so that, at least at some level, leads to this book. Why this book? We're going to talk about the title and a lot of the ideas in it in a second, but why this book, The Art of Change?
Yeah, it's interesting because it actually came from a frustration. Some of your listeners may know or may not know, I worked on the COVID vaccine. I have a patch for Rapid X. I actually start the book with it. I start the book by saying, when your country calls and says, we have a problem, we need some help with this, you do what you can do, right? The challenge of all of this was I had some of the brightest people I've ever met in my life, Kevin. And the one thing that absolutely stopped everybody is they could not handle the ambiguity of the future. They could not handle paradoxes, which of course are central to change and innovation because there is no data on the future. And the number one form of resistance is excessive data gathering, sort of getting stuck in the planning cycle. So I wrote the book saying paradoxes and ambiguity are not just a side effect of things, they are the essence of change. If you can't deal with it, you're probably not going to make change happen.
So I mentioned at the beginning that this episode is brought to you by my new book, Flexible Leadership. And for a long time, Jeff, the working title had the word paradox in it, which I think maybe drew me to your subtitle a little bit. And there's so many times I found myself as I was reading nodding, and we're going to get to all the paradox stuff in a minute. But I want to actually ask you about something it's like the last thing I read in your intro. It says that helping people move to change from the edges, not the center. What do you mean by that?
Well, innovation doesn't move inside out, it moves outside in. And I have a rule that I call the 20-80 rule. It's not the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule says well, let's turn around. The 20-80 rule says it's easier to change 20% of an organization 80% than it is to change 80% of an organization 20%. And what your listeners need to think about is a bell curve. And think about when people really change. They're in a crisis. Well, why do you change in a crisis? Because the risk of trying something radical and the reward of where you're at is reversed. It's not just people. Think about the first $1 trillion company, is a company I've been associated with forever, which is Apple, right? Apple is basically going bankrupt in 1997. And when you're in that kind of state, that's why when people get a divorce or they lose their job or somebody passes away close to them, they're likely to change. And the same is true when you're on a roll. When you're on a roll, we have what's called risk capital. So the right off the bat, the reason the edge matters is at the middle, you're protecting the rent, right? At the edges, you're not. And most people, when they start trying to launch change from the middle, they're really just doing project management. X marks the spot. If you can hit it from the day that you started, it tells you that the change that you've made is very incremental and probably not very significant.
That doesn't mean there's not a place for that. It's just not.
Yeah.
Let's just not call it what it's not, right?
Yes, and then we have a nice term for that in innovation. We call it the long tail, right? So the long tail means once we figured it out, then there's a whole bunch of stuff you get.
Right. So the book is called The Art of Change, and in the writing that I did to hopefully encourage people to come join us, I talked about that word art versus science. And so let's just talk about that for a second. Like, there is some science to change, and I find that that's where a lot of people want to focus, and yet that's why they still get stuck. So talk about the difference between art versus science.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this. And think of it like training a real artist. I mean, there's a part to anything that you do that has to do with tradecraft. You're learning to play the piano. You have to learn the white and black keys, the squiggly lines, where your hands go. This is a mazurka versus a polonaise or whatever. So the stuff you have to learn. And the same is true for change. One of the big issues is organizations actually function in some very rational ways. All organizations. This is my other favorite one. No, the military is different. No, it's not, right? It's not. And healthcare is different. No, the last 5% is, but most of it's exactly the same. Now that's the science, and you do have to learn that. The art is, what exactly are you seeing? So let me give you some things about art that I think almost all leaders get wrong. Number one, the problem's never the problem. You come in, somebody tells you what the problem is. It's never the problem. It's like going to the doctor. You read WebMD and you think you know what's wrong. Well, this person's the more experienced. They've seen thousands of patients, and they actually went to medical school, and they finesse what the problem is, and they understand that the problem is something that kind of emerges. That's art. That's not science. Second thing is the solution. The people who get blown up first in change efforts are those people who have those sayings like go big or go home. I can't tell you in my 40 years career All those guys go home. They eventually go home because that's a gamble. Most of us, the art is we sort of wade into it. We figure stuff out as we go along. As my colleague Bob Quinn says, you build the bridge as you walk over it. So there's a lot of aspects to this that are aspects that are intuitive, aspects that you're learning along the way, aspects that experience brings into it. That's art. Anyone can figure out where your hands go on the keyboard, but not anyone can be a jazz improvisational musician. That's a special skill.
I love that. So um, the book is really about these paradoxes. And before we get into the paradoxes, I'm going to let you pick the one that's your favorite to talk about, and then I may pick one as well. Uh, we'll just see how that all goes. But I really want to talk first about the role of paradox in change before we get into what they are specifically. But why is paradox so important to this art that we're talking about?
Paradox creates tensions, and tensions create generative energy, which is required to make anything better or new. So if you don't have a paradox, if something is basically just wrong, right, then step one is fix it. If something is ambiguous, then step one is wade into it, figure out what it is. If step one is it's a paradox, we need to both cut costs and raise sales at the same time. And how do we do that at the same time? What's happening is in that paradox is the very energy that is required to get to a higher point of view, a different point of view, a better point of view. Not compromise, not trying to solve for X, but trying to figure out how to use that tensive energy. So a great example is right now in America, everybody's going, oh, it's the end of the world, it's a new civil war. No, it's not that at all. The death of change and innovation is apathy. When everything's over aligned, everybody agrees, everybody's happy with what they do, nothing moves. There's no reason to move it. There's no energy. When people have different ideas, and again, there's good change and there's bad change. We don't want anything bad to happen to anybody. But that tension, that paradox provides the actual energy that's going to require to make things better and new.
Yeah, I say to people all the time, to expect there to be change without resistance is like that's not possible. And resistance is ultimately just energy. To your exact point.
And the more somebody resists something, and this is important for your listeners to understand this, the more somebody resists something, the more they believe they're protecting something sacred. The more somebody resists, the more they believe they're protecting something sacred. And that's why great change agents are almost always invisible. They're almost always people who give credit to other people, right? That's why, because those people believed they were protecting something sacred. They gave up something that was very important to them. How do we accredit them with the change that made things better and new?
So how does that relate to the idea? Kevin's already off script. How does that relate to the idea of facilitating change? Because when I think about the word facilitating, it simply just means to make it easier, and that's what I heard you saying just now. So, do you use that phrase? How does that phrase facilitating change relate
Well,
to the point you just made, Jeff?
my work is basically based on a number of other people's work through history. You're going to find Bob Quinn's model of competing values, Prahalad's model of core competencies. Remember, I'm at the Ross School for 36 years, so obviously my elders, the older brothers, had an influence on me. But my contribution is that there's creative power in constructive conflict. I'm a huge believer that you have to put very different ideas together in a room. And the reason for that is when I started studying these innovation, what we call creativity clusters, what we noticed was that the only thing that was really different about them, which produced almost all the intellectual property around the world, these big creativity clusters, is that people have different ideas and they know how to engage in these conflicts in a normative way. So it's not personal, it's not prejudice, it's not destructive, it's I'm challenging your idea. So the first how it relates is the first thing is you're trying to actually create the difficult conversation, or as I like to put it, the dinner party. You put the two people, you don't want the people who are going to be nasty to each other, but you put the two people next to each other who have different ideas. And you kind of shake the box a little bit. And you say, what are we going to get from that? Now, if they're purposeful, if they really have the intentionality of doing good things, they'll respect the other person, but that idea will move forward. And so that becomes the key of that. That becomes the key. Don't try and destroy the person. They have a belief system, and that's not why we're here. Why we're here is to challenge an idea and to see if we can get that idea to grow.
And that growth will come by us both understanding the other person's perspective and seeing it from their lens, even if we still don't agree, right?
Agree. And we have to encounter the other. The problem with the internet and with social media is it's an echo chamber. All, what, forget politics and religion, look at somebody whose interest is alt bands or something. They believe all the same crap. All of us do. And you get the likes, which are, you get the, adrenaline going. Well, those people aren't very helpful. You're not going to get to the next place. A lot of times they're liking bad ideas. The only way you're going to get to the next place is you have to encounter the loyal opposition with the concept that you're both trying, or all of you are trying to get to this better place.
So we've been hinting at what you call the paradoxical mindset challenge, but can you outline it a little more specifically? Because it sort of forms the concept of the rest of the book and the
Yeah,
rest of the ideas I want us to talk about. So go ahead.
I didn't interrupt you. Sorry. Yes, Kevin. It really came from what I noticed about people who were able to deal with paradox, and I think I'm somebody who's okay at that. I'm pretty fluent in that. Well, this first step is we tell ourselves a lot of stories. I don't know if you do it, but I do all the time. And sometimes I tell them out loud to myself, right? I'm like Tevye in Fiddler on a Roof, right? I'm always talking to myself about things. And I tell the story and I tell the story and I tell the story. And a lot of times I'm looking for what's the right way to tell the story. But a lot of times when I tell the story to myself about something that happened, I notice there's something that doesn't quite fit. It seems like there's things that I normally don't do. So let me give you an example that I give in the book. I love trees. I'm a tree guy, and I live like a hobbit on the Huron River. I'm surrounded by these 200-year-old trees everywhere, and I love them. We had a terrible snowstorm a few years back, and a lot of the big trees lost huge limbs. And I'm talking about limbs that weigh, 3 tons. I mean, these are large trees. Well, there were some trees, some apple blossoms that were going over my sunroom. And while they're cutting down these branches that needed to be cut down, a guy asked me, do you want me to just cut this tree down? Because I just wanted to trim it up so it didn't fall on the sunroom. And in a moment, I said, yeah, cut it down. And the minute he cut it down, I thought, oh my God, why did I do this? Right? I love trees. I'm normally not capricious like that. So that would be a story that I'd say there's a paradox. I love trees, but I let them cut it down. Well, the second step is you got to find the paradox. You tell the story and tell the story and tell the story till you find what's the paradox in here. And that takes time. That's not easy to do. And if your listeners are trying to figure out how to do this, I can tell you the one area where almost everybody gets it. Think about a relationship that you wanted to work that didn't. It's a perfect way to find them because you'll find, I thought it was this, but these two things happened together and I couldn't quite figure out what was at the center of this, right?
Yep.
Well, that's part of the next piece. Now, third piece. What simple rules can you divine from this? What can I divine from? I let the guy cut the tree down, or I asked the guy to cut the tree down when he asked me if I wanted to do it. Well, the simple rule would be, count to 10 or ask your wife or, develop a way to say, give me 5 minutes or 10 minutes to go through this. So that's, it's a little device, if you will, a cognitive device. And then finally, what's the experiment? Well, I tell in the book, we were out east one time with the family and the car broke down. This wasn't far after the tree issue. And now the issue became, oh, we got to fix your car and it's going to cost $1 million. And here's how we have to do it. And you say, wait a minute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try this step of giving myself some time and looking at some alternatives. And I did, and I found a very different way to handle the problem. So now all of a sudden I'm able to make this change as a habit, because I was able to deconstruct and reconstruct the paradox.
So that is how you encourage us to think about the paradoxes that you outline in the book. And I found myself, as I was reading, even just reading the titles of the chapters for each of the paradoxes, I found myself smiling In some cases, because those were things that I already recognized, those paradoxes. And in other cases, things that like, okay, I want to learn more about those. Um, and I'd just like you to pick one of them to you. Maybe it's one of your favorites. Maybe it's the one that you just felt led to talk about today. Maybe it's the one that you find people getting stuck on the most. I don't care which one you pick, Jeff, but like pick one of them to help us get an insight into the art of change, number one, and number two, to help us see how this idea of paradox can help us as we're
Yeah.
guiding change.
Yeah, one of my favorites is we use facts to change people's minds, but facts don't change people's minds, right? And I'm around these really smart people all my life, and my wife will come home and she'll start talking about how something was explained. Remember, she's the co-author of this book. My wife's extremely intelligent, right? And I'll have to stop her and say, yeah, but facts don't change people's minds. So a perfect experience, example of that, I think, would be global warming. I do a lot of work around the country, and you go to places they don't believe in it. Well, what's happened over time is some of these places have had Category 4 hurricanes. Some of these places have had their houses washed away. Some of these places live up in the mountains and they've had fires that they couldn't put out. There are things that didn't normally happen to them, and we don't wish bad things on anybody. We wish good things, pray for good things. But these bad things happen to them. And when the bad things happen to them, all of a sudden, they understood because they had an experience. Facts don't change minds, experiences do. And I want to point out, too, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but I do start the book with my work on the COVID vaccine. And one of the things that was very difficult about that, now it depends on whether you look at the Johns Hopkins study or the Brown study, right? Out of the first million people who died in the United States, 25 to 40% of them died with the vaccine available to them. Now, here's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to make a political statement at all. I'm trying to make this statement. What people believe is so powerful that they're willing to die for it, literally. And that it is only through experiences. And some people say stories and other stuff. I'm not sure that's even true. I think people have to have an experience. So what I suggest, my suggestion, is rather than waiting till somebody has a terrible experience, let them have a small experience. So this is the father in me. I have 3 children. My wife and I have a very different parenting style. My wife's style is don't do that. Don't do that. She sounds like Minnie Mouse. Don't do that. Don't do that. My style is hurt, didn't it? Hurt, didn't it? Yeah, hurt, didn't it? What do we learn from this? Right now, don't get me wrong. You don't let Junior go play on the freeway. You go get him. But the notion is, I think as parents and as leaders, we have to have the ability for the people who are around us to have some experience, hopefully limited, hopefully not bad. We wish good things for people, but have some experience about the upside and downside of what their thoughts are. They have to somehow take their thoughts and put them into the world.
Yeah, so I'll go back to your point about experiences versus stories. I think stories can plant seeds, but I'm with you that or they can reinforce, but ultimately it's got to be what I experienced.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's really hard. And it's really hard to watch somebody skin up their knees. It's really hard for somebody to watch somebody botch a presentation that could have been, a deal. It's hard. But you also know if we're trying to go forward and if we're taking the long view with our children, our colleagues, the people who we're responsible for or responsible with, maybe is a better way of putting it,
yep.
then we have to allow them to develop through their experience the same competencies that we have. Now, I don't know, Kevin, about your experience, but I've worked for some people who are not exactly the nicest people in the world, but I really learned a lot because one of the things that they typically would do is they'd say, okay, this is screwed up. You're going to have a lot of fun the next 2 nights staying up all night and trying to solve it. Yeah, I'm going to try and figure it out.
Yep. One of the other paradoxes, we're bumping up against one of the other paradoxes, which is, I'm just reading it so I get it right. We attempt to avoid failure, but all learning is developmental and requires failure. Like, how do we get there without the failure, right? Like hearing about someone else's failure, to your point earlier, is not the same as experiencing it ourselves, right?
Absolutely. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to see books that are, I wrote a book very early on, probably 30, 40 years ago called Creativity at Work. And one of the things I tried to point out in the book was that learning to change and innovate is inextricably linked to learning. There's a learning, but learning it's the same thing. Because, and there's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Dorothy Leonard, called Deep Smarts, and her husband Walter Swap, right? Deep Smarts. It's a brilliant book. She's retired. She's an old Harvard professor. I shouldn't say old, but a retired Harvard professor. And what I love about the book,
That's all relative, by the way, Jeff.
yes, I know. As I'm getting older, what I love about the book, though, is she takes you through and says, you know, look at here's how you develop actual trade craft. I did a program with Twyla Tharp years ago, and I love her, the great choreographer. And this young woman got up and said, "Well, how do you learn to be a great choreographer? I'm trying to be a choreographer." And Twyla Tharp said, "What time do you get up?" And she said, "Oh, between 9 and 10." She said, "No, you get up at 5." And she said, "And how are you learning about this?" And she said, "Oh, go to Google." No, it was all this. You haven't earned it. Her point was you haven't gone through the experience that you need to go through in order to be able to really do this. You haven't earned it.
Yeah, I love that. So let's go back. I want to, before we start to close up, and I know that you and I could go have a long conversation longer. Maybe we will someday, but not necessarily on camera / microphone. Because we could talk about all of these paradoxes. They're all fabulous ways for us to think in new ways. And I'm talking with Jeff DeGraff, one of the 2 authors of the new book, The Art of Change, transforming paradoxes into breakthroughs. And so, but I want to go back to the pandemic, and I don't necessarily want to talk about the vaccine as much as that was a time when I think all of us now we had experiences with change related to the pandemic. So like, what are some things that maybe we as leaders can take from those experiences that can help us with changes moving forward?
Yeah, the first thing was there were 2 parts, I would say, right off the bat. First thing was, when you don't know what something is, don't immediately jump to here's the solution. And that was the problem. The problem was what's called a forward position problem. Means there's a lot of ambiguity, and what we really need to do is hedge. We really need to look at a diversity of ways of handling this problem. We closed the box too early, right? So all of us, there was a lot of other things that could have been done, and we saw this in some small places. That's the first thing that could have been learned. Don't be so certain you know what things are, right, before you know what they are. And then the second thing is that, which I think goes along with this, is that anything that's worth learning reveals itself over time. So you're going to change your mind. And people who said, "Well, you know, I can't believe we did this, then we did this, and we did," I'm like, well, we had incomplete information. That's how
It all
works.
makes sense backward, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I'm like, any fool can do that. The notion is, as you're going forward, you have to adjust based on what's going on. And that was the whole thing. And once we got to that point, sort of collectively, did you notice how quickly everything went? All of a sudden, we were good at this, right? But boy, it took about 6 months or 7 months of,
At
just
least.
hang on. This is the way we sort this out. So that I think is what we really could take from it. And I think the biggest thing that we could take from it is that change is inevitable. If you read about pandemics or wars or natural resource, you can read about it in Thucydides, you can read about Herodotus, the Bible, you pick it. The human condition, the basics, the centerpiece of the human condition is change. It's not something that happens to us. The homeostasis that we believe we have, that's the part that we're imagining. The world is in flux. We are in flux. That is the key to the whole thing, understanding the dynamics. It's not so much the structure, it's the dynamics that make the difference.
Allostasis, not homeostasis.
There we go. Very good. You're right. You're right.
So, but no one wants to talk about that because they all want to talk about so listen, Jeff, is there anything, I mean, there's lots more we could talk about, and I hope everyone goes and gets a copy of the book and all of that. But is there anything we didn't talk about as this unfolded that you wish we would have, or not, or looking back now, you wish I would have asked?
Well, I think the one thing I would just say is our people can't change other people. That the one thing I think that I'd like your listeners to take away from this is that the journey starts with you. And, whether or not you can affect another person. I mean, think about it. I've been married for a long, long time. how well's that little change going, right? So the notion is how is it you're keeping track of your own journey? How is it you keeping track of your own growth, right? That's the one thing that you can actually do. That's the thing I'd really like to emphasize on that. And we're all works in progress. Forgive yourself for the things that don't work. A lot of them, and forgive yourself for the hypocrisy. I'm a terrible hypocrite this way. I sit in the same seats in the stadium I've sat in for 40 years. I drive the same car I've driven for 15 years. People always ask me, why don't I change it? Well, to me, I don't want to change it. So there are certain things in life that you want to change and certain things in life that you don't want to change. It's not a problem. It just has to work for you and the people around you that you love and care about.
Yeah, I love that. So a couple of other things before we go, kind of shifting gears. I'd love to know, Jeff, what is it that you do for fun?
Well, I travel a lot. I'm one of those almost 3 million mile guys on Delta Airlines alone. But one of the things that's fun is because I have a life that's very much like a Federal Express package around the world, I'll take an afternoon or a day off, and I love to really immerse myself in the culture, eat food, go to their temples, go to sporting events. I love sporting events. My wife now goes with me to a lot of these things. So the first thing is that I really like as a hobby is just really, really embrace the world.
Okay. The only thing you knew I was going to ask you is this. What are you reading these days, Jeff?
Well, I just read the book Abundance. I really liked it. I recommend it to people. I disagree with the part about the COVID vaccine, but that's just because I lived through it. There's a good book called The Shot That Saved the World by Zuckerman of the Wall Street Journal. I think a little better treatment of that. But I'm reading a book about the seven wonders of the ancient world by Bethany. I can't remember her last name. She's the BBC lady, and it's fascinating. I like history, and I really think that history really does tell us a lot about the human condition.
More than a lot of people want to recognize,
Yeah.
in my opinion. So, um, tell people where they can reach out to you, where they can connect with you, where they can get the book. Where do you want to point
I
people,
think
Jeff?
the easiest thing to do is I'm one of the original LinkedIn influencers. So if you go to LinkedIn, you look for me on LinkedIn, Jeff DeGraff, you'll find me. You can also find me at jeffdegraff.com, but I think it'd be easier just to contact me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to do it. And I'm also like hearing from people about, I disagree with this. Those are my favorite ones. Or have you thought about this? This might go a slightly different direction. This is the professor in me. I really like that. Let's get, let's what do the young people say? Chop it up. I think let's chop it up.
You can chop it up. You can do it on LinkedIn. You can go to jeffdegraff.com. You can go to artofchange.net. There's
Yeah.
websites
Oh
everywhere.
yeah, yeah. You can do artofchange.net. Yep, that works too. All right.
All right. So before I let Jeff go, and before I let all of you go, before this ends, I want to ask all of you the question that I ask every single episode. And the question is simply this: now what? What will you do now that you've heard this conversation? What insights do you take from this? But that's not really it. It's not really the idea, but what are you going to do with the idea that matters? I took a bunch of notes for me. But the question is, what did you take from this that you will apply? Because until you do that, this isn't nearly as valuable as using this as a collector of information is one level. Using this as a spur to or an inspiration to action is, I think, ultimately what both of us would prefer for you. And it's ultimately what will make this most valuable for you. So, Jeff, thanks so much for being here. I've been looking
Yep.
forward to it. We had a bit of a fit and start before we got here. I'm so glad we finally got the chance to do
Kevin,
this.
thanks for having me on, and thanks to your listeners for having me on, and thanks for the remarkable leadership for having me on. Thanks, guys.
All right, everybody. And so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you're subscribed wherever you're watching or listening so you don't miss any future episodes. Make sure you tell somebody else to join us as well, because that's a part of leadership, is helping others move in positive directions. Hope you'll do that. Hope you'll be back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.